Friends, colleagues, it's a great honor for me to address this highly international audience at the beginning of your conference. Let me start with a precautionary note. Virtually all of my work in the fields of political sociology and political theory has been somewhat domestic, at best European in nature, with international relations, world politics, geopolitics, related issues playing at best the role at the level of some background assumptions. So I appreciate Dean Anheyer's invitation as well as the challenging opportunity to think about Europe and the world and to address this distinguished audience with some thoughts I came up with. As the question, subtitle, "What does the future hold?" cannot be answered with any degree of certainty anyway, I'll feel free to engage in some speculations and generalizations that are likely to be controversial, which may be exactly what the literary genre of keynote addresses is meant to be. I'll do so by offering a few thoughts on 5 questions. The first question is very much in the media today. What is a world of rules and how can we achieve a world of rules? Very deep, challenging question. This is a question verbatim raised by the prominent Polish politician Radek Sikorski in a recent talk he gave at the Center for European Studies at Harvard University. How do we build a world of rules? It also happens to be the question that drives much of modern political theorizing and constitutionalist reasoning. Given the widely shared sense that the world of 2014 is undergoing a process of rapidly escalating geopolitical disorder involving various armed conflicts, economic and financial crises, outright state failures, menacing climate and environmental catastrophes, the question of how rules can be established and enforced so that something worth calling order as opposed to a global state of nature may result is most timely, most pertinent indeed. Chancellor Merkel has invoked, sternly criticizing Putin in Australia, in a recent talk she gave in Australia, as the post-Cold War world governed. She has invoked that the post-Cold War world should be governed by, quote, 21st century rules of international cooperation. So, and she spoke as if these rules were in fact clear and uncontroversial with those to whom they apply, just as it were needing a reminder to put them into effect, which I claim evidently is not the case. There is no agreement of what 21st century rules are. A would-be world of rules does not have a worldwide rule maker, which is why Sikorski clearly and honestly speaks of Western rules that he has in mind as the source of global order. His argument is worth summarizing, and it is similar to an argument yesterday in the German daily Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung made by Mr. Kornblum, the former American ambassador. The argument runs simply as follows. Due to the unilateral, liberating, and doubtlessly beneficial services the United States after World War II and the West as a whole after the Cold War have performed to the world. After all these benefits flowing from these two centers of rulemaking, Western rules and institutions have earned for themselves, as it were, a claim to universal bindingness. Yet this simple syllogism is obviously subject to contestation. It is unsurprisingly a Western ambition to create a world of Western rules. While a world of rules is doubtlessly to be preferred over a world without rules, the Hobbesian state of nature, rules and compliance with rules can be rationally resented, opposed by actors for two reasons. The first reason is that actors rightly feel that rules deprive them of the option of making unruled and unscripted unilateral moves. It is in the nature of all rules worth of the name that they limit the freedom of action of those to whom the rules apply. This is why rules, other than simple self-enforcing conventions, in the violation of which nobody can possibly have an interest, such as riding on the right side of the street, must be enforced. Rules must be enforced. And the second reason why rules can be resented, and the more important one, is they can be resented because of their being perceived as unfair. Rules can be unfair, and the terms of cooperation under rules can be biased or perceived as biased. While all rules tie the hand of the actors, of some actors, some rules tie the hands of some actors more severely than those of other actors. And that is a problem for those who are treated unfairly by the rules, as it were. The problem with rules from which a global order would derive is that there is neither a globally competent rule enforcer, nor, in the first place, a constituted and non-partisan rule maker, with both rule making and rule enforcing supposedly being a defining part of what we mean by public policy. Incidentally, a charming puzzle came up when preparing these notes, and it is offered by the very name of the organization I am addressing, the Global Public Policy Network. What is it, one might ask, that is global in this term? As there is at best very little deserving the name of global public policy, it must be the global network. Anyway, as current TTIP negotiations make plain, it is hard enough to design and enforce rules governing economic and commercial relations between highly diverse economies. It is far more difficult to design and enforce rules regulating the use states make of the one resources, the monopoly control of which is their defining privilege and characteristic, namely the use of physical force or the threat thereof, be it against their own population or part thereof, or be it against other states. That is the most difficult field of rule making of all, for the reasons given. The validity and operational effectiveness of rules ultimately, or so is my claim, ultimately depends upon the trust that they will in fact be observed by others, even in the absence, that is, of the power to enforce them, the incentives to induce compliance, or the positive knowledge concerning the future course of action of others. If we have none of them, incentives, power, knowledge, if we have none of them, we can only trust that the other side will act reasonably. The ultimate source of operational effectiveness or bindingness of rules is each player's trusting presupposition that everyone else, reasonable, cooperative dispositions, which in turn derive from the rules being recognized as largely fair, and therefore, so this recognition as fair, and therefore compliance with them is in everyone's enlightened self-interest. Or Alexis Tocqueville, self-interest rightly understood, well considered, well reflected, and then it comes automatically, even the absence of enforcers, right? That is the assumption. The rule, for instance, invoked by Radek Sikorski in this talk that he gave at Harvard, that every state, I quote him, must be considered free to join a supranational defense alliance of its choice, does not evidently meet this criterion. Such choice can have weighty negative externalities for others, such as the Russian Federation. There's a famous, one of my favorite lines from Henry Kissinger, where he says, quote, "Total security for one side means total insecurity for everyone else." Security has externalities, negative externalities on others. Security, it seems, is not to be had without projecting insecurity on others. These externalities of the free choices states can make, according to Sikorski, must be compensated for through guarantees that are accepted as adequate by the actors who is, or to complicate things, or neurotically considers himself, or insincerely only pretends to be victim of these externalities, or who sees himself as being taken unfair advantage of. To continue with Sikorski, since 1990, 12 European states have asked to join NATO. They all chose for themselves to belong to this military alliance, implying that they are totally and self-understood entitled to do so. In order to maintain a strategic balance, it is not enough that, as Sikorski claims, constant efforts were made by NATO and the EU to reassure Russia. In addition, these efforts, these alleged efforts must be appreciated as adequate and satisfactory by the agent at whom they are targeted. A condition which obviously does not apply to Russia and its president, as became evident from yesterday's talk, which in turn serves the latter, Putin, as an excuse to violate rules which are intended to tie his hands. Absent such adequate compensation and assurance, the sense of being externally threatened and the indignation over being taken unfair advantage of, which can itself be an important source of domestic support and can be instrumentalized as such by political elites, particularly under conditions of economic crisis. This sense of being taken unfair advantage of can result in retaliatory or preemptive measures to destabilize neighboring states through mobilizing external ethnic, linguistic, and religious minorities residing in those states across the border, right? It's obvious what I'm referring to, but it can be generalized way beyond Ukraine. In the current dynamics of East European conflicts, this pattern applies to cases of Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, and Ukraine. Its extension is currently being feared by the Baltic states, in particular Latvia and Estonia, with their large ethnic Russian minorities, as well as Serbia, with its historical, ethno-religious, and linguistic ties to Russia. The disruptiveness and destabilizing effects of such ethno-protectionist concerns for external minorities, our brothers and sisters over there, right? There used to be a German variant of this discourse. This is the disruptiveness and destabilizing effects of such ethno-protectionist concerns for external minorities derives from the ambiguities inherent in the Ukraine conflict. This conflict can be framed in two ways, either as being a highly legitimate secessionist or separatist movement making demands which have risen in response to the behavior of repressive ethnic majorities. That is the mistaken and misleading version of the Kosovo analogy to Ukraine, right? Or alternatively, they can be framed as blatantly illegitimate, namely as externally launched aggression by an imperial power aiming at the annexation, in the case of Crimea, under the mere pretext of protecting external kin minorities that violates the basic rule enshrined in the codes of international law that states must respect borders and the territorial integrity of other states. So two entirely different opposed readings that are claimed by the East and by the West, and this is the source of the problem. There's clearly a large gray zone, to be sure, between these two polar opposite readings of the situation. Rules can apply, however, only after these ambiguities have been resolved by an authoritative and mutually consented interpretation of the situation, which is exactly what is missing, as all sides are involved as parties to the conflict, or are at least suspected and denounced as such. Even if everyone were committed to comply with the rules, the conflict is over the adequate understanding of the nature of the situation to which the rules are supposed to apply. That is the problem. We cannot agree about the nature of the situation. The prevalence of this, as it were, semantic disagreement concerning how to describe the nature of the conflict results in a shift of, or at least a second-order controversy over, the categories to be employed. Where there used to be contractual international relations, diplomatic initiatives, interstate negotiations over security issues, all of which start with agreed upon and mutually recognized territorial borders of states and the umbrella of international law, we now see, and not just in Eastern Europe, the recourse to ethno-religious identities and supposedly sacrosanct ethno-territorial spheres of power and influence. To, in a word, normatively naked geopolitics, as opposed to international politics conducted in a framework of international law. The former discourse of international law presupposes the possibility of an agreed-upon, fair, even quasi-constitutional, at any rate normatively founded international order established and enforced by rule-bound states maintaining non-violent and peaceful relations with each other. While the latter discourse insists upon the factually, not normatively, factually overpowering realities of conflicting claims to the rule of ethnic communities over regions, with the historically validated and ethnically identified entitlements of regional powers to exercise that rule. To overstate my point, with this semantic shift of reading the situation, we enter onto a slippery slope, at the bottom of which the discourse of territorial states and their citizens is being replaced by an existential discourse of race and Lebensraum. That is the German Nazi term for space to which we have an existential claim, whatever the law says, right? That is The shift is that from a cosmopolitan understanding of the rights of citizenship granted and protected by states versus the factual properties and power resources of ethno-national communities unilaterally claiming control over contested territory. Radical proponents of the latter discourse are categorically disinterested in living in a world of rules. And that is a problem that Sikorski, to the best of my knowledge, does not address. While Sikorski, Merkel, and the West in general calls upon Russia to return to the world of rules, the Russian president denounces the West for having itself aggressively, if under the mere pretext of complying with international law, engaged in a struggle for geopolitical transgression by challenging and threatening Russia's legitimate geopolitical sphere of regional control, and by allowing and inviting its neighbors, Russia's neighbors, to join a particular defense alliance called NATO and associate itself with the EU. The conflict, in short, is over the right reading of the conflict and its causes, a conflict between incompatible discourses. Now, this can all be illustrated handily with yesterday's talk by Mr. Putin, and I strongly recommend that you read it in the light of this incompatibility of two discourses. Let me come to my second question. It is always useful, I found for myself as well as in teaching, to have a ideally complete list of trends, trajectories, developments that we observe in the present world. This is a two-digit number of observations. It should not be three-digit, it is more than one digit, and it is amazingly difficult often to agree or disagree with good reasons on someone's list of the phenomena. And I will very rapidly go through some of the things that I think we all know, but I put them together in order to get a reasonably, adequately complex picture. First, the end of the Cold War and the extension of NATO and EU to the Central Eastern European region, accompanied with both the widening and the deepening of the EU and following it, the Eurozone. Second, in the meantime, almost 7-year-old unresolved fiscal, financial market, economic, institutional and political crisis within and between the member states of the EU. This is what the little book is about. Third, a declining relative economic and demographic strength of Europe, which also lacks a shared and reasonably coherent common foreign and security policy, and depends for its security largely on the United States. Fourth, there is a long-term shift of global centers of gravity from north and west to the east and south. This is what we mean by the Asian century, the decline of the US in terms of hegemony and moral prestige, the disintegration of the West due to widening gaps and estrangements in US-European relations, exacerbated by phenomena such as recent NSA activities, Snowden revelation, and so on. The tendency of the US to look inward and eastward, Pacific region, rather than toward Europe. The Atlantic Ocean, in a word, has become wider. Distrust, estrangement, and a high-tech rivalry dominate this scene. At the same time, BRICS, the 5 countries of BRICS, which make up 43% of the world population and no less than 20% of the global GDP. So this is tectonic shifts that I just wanted to mention and known to all of us. Further 6, I think, there is an evolving multipolarity of strategic partnerships fluctuating strategic partnerships driven neither by ideological nor political and military alliances, but by trade relations. Between 2005 and 2011, I found this amazing, the figures. German exports to China grew by 206%, compared with German trade growing 24% for the EU and a mere 6.3% with the US. The overall development can be summarized as a move from solid alliances, known as the West, based upon a set of values, principles, institutional patterns, and liberal democracy, to a strategy of voluntaristic, trade-driven, perhaps opportunistic networking and partnering with whoever is situationally considered a Gestaltungsmacht, the new term in German foreign policy, meaning something like a power that in a given situation is able to shape things, in particular markets. But that can be different 2 years from now. My next point, I have forgot the number. We can thus speak of an end of ideology in international and geopolitical relations, with ideology meaning a coherent, now typically biased and self-deceptive set of contested ideas concerning how the social, economic, and political well-being of citizens, of states, and finally of mankind as a whole must be organized and eventually achieved. This is what ideologies do, these visions. National polities, as well as the international system, used to be organized along ideological cleavage lines, economic and political liberalism, that is, versus totalitarian communism or state socialism. This ideological cleavage structure is clearly a matter of the past that ended with the Cold War and the simple geopolitics structured by the Iron Curtain, or the convenient division of the world into first, second, and third world. Is also a matter of the past with the coming of BRICS terminology. Today's fault lines, and actually as well as potential lines of conflict, are defined not by ideas and ideologies, but either by commercial interests or ethno-religious identities, with their claims to their unconditional recognition as source of existentially binding ultimate authority. This global configuration of my three I-terms, I come to this, namely ideologies, interests, and identities, has undergone dramatic changes. Let me briefly elaborate this little theoretical part of my talk. One might say, with authors ranging from Max Weber to Jon Elster, that from each of the three human collectivity regarding faculties we know, and there are only three, namely those of having ideas, having interests, pursuing interests, and having identities, particular associative patterns follow. Ideas crystallize in political movements, in parties, in constitutions, and alliances of states. Interests crystallize in social classes and their associations, coalitions, and contractual partnerships, and identities, finally, in ethnic and religious communities of a primordial kind that do not allow for any questioning, as they are considered existential givens, supported by passionate commitments. The same typology applies to modes of conflict resolution. In the case of conflicting ideas, you argue. For instance, you argue over rights. If the conflict is one of interest, you bargain and split the difference according to each side's bargaining power. It is only the constitutionally undomesticated identity conflict between them and us, between believers and non-believers, or those belonging here and not belonging here, for which hardly any constructive solution is known, except that of fighting. Internally and externally fighting through repression, through force, and through military violence. Next slide. While the West prides itself of having accomplished, as the fruit of its constitutional history and the achievement of liberal democracy, the pacifying transformation of both economic class conflicts and ethno-religious identity conflicts into conflicts over rights that can be resolved through argument and the under the institutional roof of liberal democracy. The West and its alleged civilizing transformation just described has allowed itself to become, in many parts of the world, suspected as a pseudo-universalist cover for imperial ambitions and values that are themselves rooted in Western Christianity and fundamentally alien to and intolerant of other cultures in their respective geopolitical settings. So the self-celebration of the West, we have overcome these class interests and identity interests in the name of arguing under the roof of liberal democracy, is being questioned as a narrative that truthfully and authentically applies. And that is one line of tension that we should keep in mind. The resurgence of geopolitics can be seen as just the reverse side of the decline of ideas, with a credible claim to universal global recognition as to their capacity to reconcile conflict. Once you stop trusting in the potency of arguments under the institutional umbrella of national and supranational constitutions, you are likely to fall back to either the unrestrained pursuit of economic and commercial interests in the globally successful pattern of what Michael Ignatieff has described as authoritarian capitalism, cum consumerism, and or the equally unrestrained and equally authoritarian defense of ethno-religious identities. So if you win in the first game, you are less dependent on the second game. But if you lose in the first game, much ethnic identity struggles will result. And in order to save time, I'm not referring to MENA at the moment, or do not elaborate it. The facile belief that there is an automaticity driving the transition from economic liberalism, market liberalism, a regime of free markets, to political liberalism, a regime of free people, has been rendered obsolete by much recent experience. Neither of the two variants of authoritarianism, capitalist and competitiveness-driven authoritarianism and identity-based authoritarianism, allows for what is the key defining feature of liberal democracy, namely a political opposition capable of holding governments accountable and of promulgating and mobilizing for credible alternatives. I'm skipping a few thoughts here, but the whole discourse on rollback of democracy under globalization and under post-communist and other phenomenon of identity politics is a big theme also in the school. We have discussed it at various occasions. Next point, territorial state borders are no longer, as we know, impermeable. On the one hand, they are perforated by globalization, namely commercial exchange and financial relations and economic dependency, supranational regimes and military alliances. They are also perforated and openly disrespected by conflicting and territorially unbounded ethno-religious identities with their unlimited spatial ambitions, beginning, by the way, with Catholicism, with the very term positing the global validity claim of a religious creed, and not ending with today's IS. Every primordial community has its brothers, or will be brothers, to be awakened and converted, or deadly threatening enemies to be fought beyond the border. It also tends to suspect dissident minorities, be they migrant or autochthonous, within our borders as potential fifth columns and potential bridgeheads of hostile foreign cultural influences subverting our identity. In German we had the happily defunct term now, Leitkultur, and be it lead culture, right? And be it only because of the alleged costliness for us of their being here. Migration is this huge topic that Europe has not yet come to term with, but needs to do so. The next point, the more identity issues and interests in commerce and investment drive the initiatives of states, the less soft power plays a role. It has been observed that China has no friends who consider the Chinese polity, like we used in the post-war periods, relate to the US polity, consider Chinese polity and its policies as normatively appealing and as an hegemonic example to emulate on normative grounds. It seems that China can perfectly do without friends. As long can do without friends, without hegemony, without charismatic ideas to be spread around the globe, as long as it has customers and its suppliers of foreign direct investment, and as long as these remain available, and as long as divisive internal challenges based on ethnic, religious, linguistic identities can be controlled by means of repression and deterrence, or by means of co-optation and consumerism. And both is widely applied in today's China. Next, from the point of view of the OECD world and its political and economic elites, the world is no longer divided into ideological friends and enemies. It is instead divided on the one hand into regions and groups of countries that are defined. So all these pockets of countries, the EU, the OECD world, the BRICS, the emerging economies, the lower category of BRICS, sometimes as it is used, that is economies such as Mexico, Indonesia, and Turkey. Then China as a category by itself, Asia Pacific as the geopolitical region with the greatest dynamic, and so forth. So the world is fragmented into shifting tectonic plates where you can pick your Gestaltungsmacht according to circumstances. BRICS is an ideologically, for instance, is an ideologically incoherent conglomerate of states and societies kept together by consumerism. Next point. At the same time, there's the rise of East Asia, with the Pacific as the core region of global economic and political dynamics. There are many unsettled issues, among them numerous territorial disputes in the South China Sea and far beyond, within the East Asia region and across the Pacific. In sharp contrast to Europe, post-war Asia has not managed to settle conflicts and come to terms with the past through the building of frameworks of rules and of regional cooperation. Interestingly, in none I read, not that I know that from my own knowledge, I read that in none of the major East Asian languages there is a word for Asia. Perhaps an indication of the absence of a sense of shared destiny of a global region. There is no equivalent to NATO or EU in East Asia. Asia does not have a shared history and a shared religion. Asia, the name Asia, is tellingly a Western exonym, you know, a description that outsiders use, just as Nippon for Japan is a Chinese exonym, meaning the land in the east or the land of the sunrise. Next point, decline of the global power of the US. Failure to settle or end conflict in Syria, Israel occupied territories, failure to come to terms with the aftermath of the Iraq War and the rise of IS as its direct result. That is an important new fact in global politics. More generally, we observe the breakup of the synthesis that made up the synthesis of realism and idealism. I mean, Wilson and said Roosevelt as a synthesis, as the foundation of Pax Americana. I'm not going to elaborate this again. Next, and I think final point, concerning trajectories and what is new. Idealist projects of externally orchestrated regime change and DPP, democracy, protection and promotion, have succeeded only in the context of both post-war defeat and Cold War defeat. Post-war defeat meaning Germany, Italy, Japan and Austria after World War II, plus in the meantime, to be sure, Grenada and Panama. These are the only examples of externally initiated democratic transitions. The only other success story is the EU's Eastern enlargement, where the regime change, if not caused, so assisted and consolidated by the EU's access conditionality, was appealing to strong economic interests on the part of the new member states, as well as the West's equally strong political interests of rolling back the Russian sphere of interest and influence by stabilizing minimally liberal democratic regimes in the 10 post-communist countries which are now member states of the EU. But the third major question, I make it very short, is and we all should have a reasoned answer to that, although we probably will disagree on some item. What is new in terms of trends and patterns of domestic politics, and how do the respective trends give rise to international global policies? I mean, this is the million-dollar question of how domestic politics and international relations interact. Let me mention just 3 keywords. I mentioned already the spread of authoritarian cum market liberalism or neoliberalism. Second, the spread dramatic over the last 4 years to 70 countries of negative politics of protest. Occupy, Indignados, Maidan. Ivan Krastev has a nice piece in a recent issue of Journal of Democracy. Thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, everywhere we see the evaporation of distinctive leftist, socialist, social democratic forces and policies. A debate has started, for instance, in the ranks of the French Parti Socialiste, whether or not its very name must be changed, as the term socialist has become positively meaningless to constituencies both inside and outside of the party. Similarly, the leading British leftist commentator Neil Lawson poses the pertinent question in an essay published last week, quote, "If social democracy is still alive, it is hard to recognize how and why." If we have still time for a little anecdote, I hope we have 1 minute. In April this year, I had the opportunity to participate in an academic conference organized at the Academy of the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing, the place where the future cadres are trained. This conference happened to coincide with the visit of the leader of the German Linkspartei, the leftist party, who was, in a way correctly, introduced to the audience as the leader of the opposition in the German Bundestag. After delivering a standard speech, basically saying not everything was bad in the GDR, but much of it was, a senior professor of the academy, visibly great in decades of service for the Communist Party, raised the first question. The question was, can you elaborate, Dr. Gysi, what you and your party are actually opposed to? clearly implying that there can hardly be anything to disagree with, given a government with which, a German government, with which China entertains such flourishing economic relations. I was unable to find out whether the questioner was motivated by naive amazement or the desire to teach the speaker a lesson. Dr. Gysi is not known for being easily made speechless, but here he seemed to be. These are all features of post-democracy, the absence of an opposition, and that itself amounts to what Chancellor Merkel often repeats, and I mean, she is factually right. We live in a world in which there are no alternatives in ideological terms. Fourth question, what are the issues of global public policy on the agenda of the 21st century? Big question. There are only three answers that come at the top, and then at the bottom there come a few others. First, environmental and resource crisis. Second, climate. And third, security, including the physical security of refugees, the physical security of people suffering from easily preventable diseases, and so forth. This is the trio. It is not human rights. It is not liberalization, democratization. This is the trio entangled in itself of environment, climate, and security. Fifth and final point, I heard a recent talk by Mr. Solana, where he claimed that interdependence at the global scale must beget cooperation, collective action, the pooling and sharing of resources. And my question is, does it? And if so, under what conditions? In the often quite shallow rhetoric of globalization, the key term is that of interdependence. Interdependence refers to the phenomenon that supposedly remote causes have immediate consequences here and now. Distances in time and space shrink. Spillover of negative externalities across time, discussed in the name of acceleration, and space, Ebola being an example, the combined effect of, okay, we can think of many examples. Yet the widely shared perception of interdependence giving rise to cooperation is not watertight. The ability to dump negative externalities on others is highly attractive as a source of social and economic power. Compare only the recent debate on Luxembourg's tax system with the negative externality of depriving neighboring states of fiscal revenues while gaining investment, right? So we are interdependent, but we do not care. That is the point. It is only if those on the receiving side of negative externalities are sufficiently powerful to resist negotiations on the regulation and eventual containment of such negative externalities can start. For that to happen, we need an institutional framework, such as the EU, which provides access to losers in the interdependency game and allows them to make their complaints heard. That, at least, applies to externalities in space. It does not equally apply to externalities or long-term negative consequences of today's action in time, as there is no conceivable bargaining table that provides seats for representatives of future generations. But there is always an alternative scenario, a non-cooperative one in the face of interdependency. Presumed victims can unilaterally establish barriers or indulge in deliberate future discounting designed to stop the actual inflow and even the perception of negative externalities in the first place. On both sides of the Atlantic, we see the rise of powerful electoral mobilizations based on the simple precept of strengthening borders building building stronger borders. The respective move is not to negotiate the regulation of externalities or argue about rights to be compensated, but to close borders, and thus supposedly to stop externalities from materializing in the first place. These policy doctrines, be they anti-migration, anti-burden sharing, anti-Brussels, anti-EU, culturally anti-modernist and xenophobic, or simply neo-mercantilist, all the same thing, propose interdependence and autarky, as Putin did in response to the threat of Western sanctions, as an antidote to interdependence with its negative externalities. This is what unilaterally imposed protective tariffs used to be meant to accomplish. The trick is not to solve collective action problems, but to avoid, at least deny them for the time being, through the strengthening of borders, threshold walls, and barriers by which agents, wrongly yet consequentially, hope to accomplish two things. First, the inflow of undesired and foreign items must be prevented, and second, the outflow of desirable items, funds, and other material resources is avoided. Actors seek to immunize themselves from interdependence as engaged communities. The craving for stronger borders is the common denominator of populist rightist political forces intent on keeping valued resources in while filtering unwelcome ones out. Political forces that today are winning one political contestation after the other, particularly in the better off north and west of the EU. To conclude, Henry Kissinger, in his new book on world order, takes the view that after the bipolar world of the Cold War, we live in a world of disorder. Its two features are chaos and interdependence, without anyone inside who would be capable and endowed with the authority to make and enforce binding rules. A world without agency capable of answering the question of what do we seek to prevent and what do we seek to achieve, with perhaps the ultimate puzzle being enshrined in the very meaning of the word we. Thank you very much.